I'm Claire Morgan, 24 years old, and the day I graduated from Berkeley with honors in business should have been one of the proudest moments of my life, but standing in front of all my relatives under a banner that read, "Congratulations, Claire." My father lit my diploma on fire. He held it high over the fireplace, looked me straight in the eye, and dropped it into the flames without blinking. My mother stood beside him, clutching a folder of papers I'd never seen before, and my older sister, the one they'd always adored, watched it burn with a smile on her face. They told me this was about family fairness. They said I had a choice, but I knew better. Before I go any further, drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from, and tap that like and subscribe if you've ever had someone try to take what you earned just because they thought they could. I grew up in a small town outside Sacramento. Not much money, not much noise, just early mornings hand-me-downs and the sound of my dad's voice reminding me that loyalty meant everything. He said it when I was 8 and gave my sister the last piece of cake. He said it again when I was 16, cleaning up after a birthday party that wasn't mine. My sister Megan is 5 years older. She was always the bold one, big, laugh-shiny hair, a way of walking into a room that made people turn. Even when she stumbled, and there were plenty of stumbles, my parents treated her like she was made of glass and gold. When she failed 3 classes senior year, they hired private tutors and still threw her a backyard party with balloons and a taco truck. When I made the dean's list, they nodded and said good job, then asked if I could babysit Megan's dog while she went on a trip to Palm Springs. I used to think maybe they just didn't notice, that if I worked harder, stayed quiet, stayed steady, maybe one day they'd see me the way they saw her. But the only person who ever truly looked at me like I mattered was my grandfather, Richard Morgan. He wasn't flashy, just a man with calloused hands and a quiet voice who built a construction company from nothing. When I was 15, he started asking me to help with his bookkeeping on Sundays. We'd sit at the kitchen table going over invoices and taxes. Later, we'd move to the porch and drink lemonade. Sometimes he'd say, "You've got a head for this, Claire. Don't ever doubt it." He taught me more than numbers. He taught me what steadiness looked like, what respect felt like. When I got into Berkeley, he was the one who loaded up my car, drove me down the highway, and unpacked every box into my freshman dorm. My parents couldn't come. Megan had just totaled her car, and they had to handle it. During sophomore year, Grandpa was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. My Sunday visits became more frequent. He didn't complain much, but I could tell his world was getting smaller. I started helping him organize his estate meeting with his lawyer Marcus, going over files in quiet corners of his house. One Sunday he said it straight, "I'm leaving the house and most of my savings to you. You're the only one who's earned it." I tried to push back, but he raised a hand. "Don't argue. Your sister will spend it faster than I made it. And your parents never saw you for who you are." He passed away 3 months before graduation. I didn't cry much at the funeral. Maybe because it felt like I still heard him in my head, reminding me to stand up straight. His lawyer told me the will wouldn't be read until after I finished school. "He wanted you to focus," Marcus said. "He didn't want anything to distract you from finishing what you started." After Grandpa died, something shifted. My parents, who'd barely called in years, suddenly wanted to know how I was doing. Megan texted me a selfie and said, "Happy birthday, hope you're slaying." They weren't subtle. I could feel it coming. But I never imagined they'd turn my graduation party into a trap. I never thought they'd stand in a room full of people and try to force my hand. And I sure didn't expect them to throw away everything I'd worked for literally. That was the day I walked away from my family for the first time, but not the last. I didn't say anything as I left that house, just kept walking down the front steps past the guests, pretending not to stare, and out to the driveway where Marcus was already unlocking his car. We didn't speak until we were halfway down the road, the echo of my father's shouting still clinging to the back of my mind. "You don't deserve Grandpa's money." he'd said, his voice shaking as he threw my diploma into the fire. He didn't know that burning it only confirmed everything my grandfather had warned me about. He didn't know I'd been preparing for this moment for years. Marcus took me to a small diner about 20 minutes away, the kind with cracked leather booths and chipped coffee cups that somehow made you feel safer just by sitting down. The waitress poured us both a mug before we even ordered. He let me sit there a while, hands wrapped around the cup before he finally asked, "Are you okay?" I told him the truth. No, but I would be the next morning. The reality started setting in. Not just the silence between me and my parents, but the flood of messages that poured in like clockwork texts from extended family, asking what really happened. A voicemail from my cousin Jennifer saying she was sorry she hadn't spoken up when things escalated. 3 missed calls from Megan, then more than 24 from my mother. I ignored everyone, but the message that stuck with me came from a number I didn't recognize. "Your parents told us you've been manipulated. You need to think about what you're doing to this family." Marcus had warned me that this wasn't just about money, it was about control, and that once I stopped playing my part, they'd come at me from every angle. He helped me set up a folder to archive every text call and email we made. Digital copies logged each one, even hired a cybersecurity expert when someone tried hacking my email from my parents' IP address 3 days after the party. I got a call from the security company watching over Grandpa's house. "We've had another breach attempt." They said this time the footage was clear. My parents had tried to force open the back door when the alarm triggered. My father smashed a stained glass window on his way out. I sat in Marcus's office, watching the footage, still not quite believing what I was seeing. "We'll file a report," he said quietly. "They've crossed a line that same evening. My cousin Jennifer called again." Her voice was low, nervous. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I heard Uncle Frank talking to your dad. They're planning to claim Grandpa had dementia when he wrote the will." I didn't speak right away. Just sat there listening to her breathe on the other end. "They're saying you knew he wasn't well and pressured him to change it," she added. I told her it wasn't true, and it wasn't. Grandpa had been clear-headed until the very end. His doctor would confirm it. His lawyer would confirm it. But that didn't stop the weight of it from sinking in. They were going to drag his name through the mud to get what they wanted, and they were going to try to drag me down with it. Marcus wasn't surprised. He'd already been expecting this. He pulled out folders from his desk paperwork I hadn't seen before. Grandpa had been going to regular cognitive evaluations for 3 years. He'd recorded his will signing. He'd left behind a video. All of it was ready to go. But there was something else, too. "Your sister's situation is more serious than you might realize," Marcus said. He'd hired a private investigator to figure out why my parents were so frantic about the inheritance. Megan wasn't just irresponsible with money. She owed more than $200,000 in gambling debt, not credit cards, not student loans, real debt to people who didn't care what they had to do to get it back. My parents had already taken out a second mortgage on their own house to bail her out. Before now, they were looking for something bigger, something fast, and they'd seen Grandpa's estate as their way out the day after that. While I was getting coffee, Marcus called again. "We've got a bigger problem," he said. My parents had used the medical power of attorney. Grandpa had given my mom, intended only for health-related decisions, to take out a second mortgage on his house before he passed. It was a clear abuse of power, possibly fraud. We began locking everything down. I changed all my passwords, froze vulnerable accounts, hired a new security team for the house. Marcus filed a cease and desist against my parents for harassment, and just when I thought the worst had already come, he handed me a sealed envelope from Grandpa, his handwriting on the front, a little shakier than I remembered. I waited until that night when I was alone again in the hotel. The letter was only 1 page, but it said more than anything. They'd screamed at me that day in the living room. He told me he was sorry, that he'd always hoped this wouldn't happen, but if it had, he wanted me to know. "I wasn't wrong for standing my ground," he said. I reminded him of himself. Not because I was smart or capable, but because I knew how to hold a boundary and mean it. He told me I didn't owe anyone anything, and that what he left me wasn't a reward, it was recognition. There was a line I kept reading over and over again. "You can't pour from an empty cup, Claire. Protect yourself. They've already taken too much." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my bag. The next morning I called Marcus. "I want to see everything I said. No more surprises. Tell me everything Grandpa set up." And he did. We had the law on our side, the paperwork, the recordings, the security, but more than anything, I had my grandfather's quiet voice in my memory reminding me that I wasn't alone. The official will reading was less than a week away. They'd be there, Megan. My parents, probably their lawyer too, and I'd be ready for whatever they planned to throw next. The morning of the will reading. I woke up before my alarm. The hotel room was still just pale light pushing through the sheer curtains. I dressed without rushing hair, pulled back, neutral dress, nothing flashy. Marcus had asked me to arrive early. "Let them come into your space," he'd said. So I did. The law offices of Goldstein and Associates sat on the corner of a quiet block, a tall building with red brick and a polished brass door. The receptionist greeted me by name, offered water, then walked me to this conference room. It smelled faintly of leather and lemon polish. Dark chairs around a heavy table, one wall lined with books behind glass. Marcus was already there. He nodded once, then gestured for me to sit beside him. I chose the chair closest to the far end of the table, facing the door. From there I could see everyone as they came in at exactly 10. My parents walked in together. My mother's heels clicked across the wood. She wore navy and pearls, eyes red like she'd been crying. My father said nothing, just adjusted his cuff and took a seat without looking my way. Megan followed behind them, lips tight, arms crossed. Then came a man I didn't recognize, tall, thin, nervous-looking. He introduced himself as their attorney, Gerald Peters. More family filed in Uncle Ted. Quiet and steady, Aunt Sharon, who'd called me 4 times that week, 2 cousins from Grandpa's side, whispering as they took their seats. The room filled slowly. Marcus waited until the clock struck 10:15. Then he stood close the door and cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "We're here for the official reading of the last will and testament of Richard Harold Morgan." He paused. "Please remain respectful. Any disruptions, and I'll ask you to leave the room." He began reading it, started with the usual formal language. Then came the small bequests, 5,000 to his church, his fishing gear, to Uncle Ted, pearl earrings, for my mother, passed down from my grandmother. Then Marcus turned the page to my granddaughter, Claire Morgan. I leave my residence at 1423 Oak Lane, including all furnishings and personal contents as well as the sum of $2. $4 million representing the majority of my liquid assets and investments. My mother made a sound, half gasp, half sob. Megan leaned toward her lawyer, who whispered something and took notes. Marcus continued, "Furthermore, I have established the Richard Morgan Trust with Claire Morgan as sole beneficiary and trustee. I will serve as administrator until she reaches the age of 30. My father slammed his hand on the table. "This is outrageous," he said. "He wasn't in his right mind when he made those changes." "Gerald," their lawyer cleared his throat, "my clients believe there's sufficient evidence to contest the will on the grounds of diminished capacity and undue influence," he said. "They contend that Mr. Morgan was manipulated into these arrangements by Claire while experiencing cognitive decline." Marcus remained calm. "I expected these objections," he said, "which is why Richard made extensive preparations to document his mental state." He nodded to his assistant, who rolled a television into the room and set it in the center. Marcus pressed play. Grandpa appeared on the screen, seated in the den. I knew so well. His posture was a little slouched, but his eyes were alert, his voice steady. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone," he said. "And if my daughter Susan or her husband Frank are contesting my will, let me be perfectly clear. I made these decisions with full mental awareness and of my own accord." The room went still. Grandpa spoke of the years he'd spent watching Megan burn through loans and savings, how my parents had asked him repeatedly for money, how I was the only one who had never asked, never expected anything, but always showed up. He named the doctors who evaluated him. He referenced the dates. The will had been updated. He listed the steps he took to protect his decisions. Claire didn't manipulate me. He said she earned my trust. She earned this legacy. My mother was openly weeping now. My father's face had gone a deep red. Megan sat stiff, her eyes locked on the floor. Then came the part none of them expected to. My daughter Susan and her husband Frank. I leave $50,000. To my granddaughter Megan, I also leave $50,000 held in trust to be used solely for educational or addiction, recovery purposes should she choose to seek help. Megan's head shot up. The family murmured. My mother looked stunned. My father stood again, pacing behind his chair. Then Grandpa added one last line: "If any beneficiary attempts to contest this, will or coerce another into surrendering their portion, their bequest will be revoked entirely and instead donated to the Parkinson's Research Foundation. I've also set aside $250,000 in legal defense to make sure that happens." The screen faded to black. The room stayed quiet. Marcus spoke next. As you can see, Richard's wishes were explicit and legally sound. "If you wish to proceed with litigation, be aware you'll forfeit your inheritance and face a legal process. You will not win." My father pointed a finger. "He's controlling us from the grave. This isn't right." Marcus didn't flinch. "The choice is yours," he said. My mother whispered something to Gerald. Megan looked at me for the first time that day. She didn't say anything. I spoke. "Then he knew what you'd try to do," I said. "He knew exactly what you'd all say today." I turned to Megan. "He knew about the gambling, about the debt, about the second mortgage you asked them to take out to cover it." Her jaw clenched. Uncle Ted cleared his throat. "He told me too. He said I spoke to him not long before he passed. He was sharp as ever." My father gathered his coat. "This isn't over," he said. Gerald gently touched his shoulder. "I wouldn't advise pushing this," he said quietly. Marcus handed them each an envelope. "These are the documents for your bequests. You have 30 days to accept the terms or forfeit the funds." They left together. Megan paused at the doorway for a second. I thought she might say something. Instead, she leaned in and muttered, "You always wanted to be the favorite. Well, congratulations." Then she walked out. The room emptied slowly. Uncle Ted gave me a quiet pat on the shoulder before he left. Aunt Sharon murmured an apology. Marcus sat back down beside me. "How are you feeling?" he asked. I looked down at my hands folded on the table. "Tired," I said. He nodded, understandable. Then he handed me another envelope. This one sealed with wax. "Richard asked me to give you this privately," he said. I didn't open it right away, but I felt the weight of it in my hand as I walked out of the office. I waited until that night to open the envelope Marcus had handed me. I was staying at the house now. My house. The lights were low in the hallway, the air still. I sat down at Grandpa's old desk, the one he built himself from walnut planks back in the 70s. The envelope was heavier than it looked, sealed with wax. I broke it open slowly. Inside was a short note, handwritten in Grandpa's familiar script. "Claire, in the basement behind the water heater, there's a safe. This key opens it. What's inside was never meant to be part of the official will, but it's yours. Use it wisely. Love, always, Grandpa." I sat with the note a moment, then went downstairs. The basement had always smelled faintly of cedar and old paint. The water heater stood in the back corner, just like it always had. I moved aside, a few boxes crouched down, and ran my hand along the back wall. There, it was a steel safe bolted to the floor. I fit the key into the lock and turned inside were two thick folders, one labeled investments, the other labeled journal. Private. I opened the investment file. First inside were detailed records, stocks, long-term bonds, property holdings. I'd never heard him mention companies he'd invested in quietly over the years, many of which had grown substantially. By the time I finished reading through them, I realized what I was holding: over $5 million in assets. Grandpa had never included in the official estate. I put the papers back carefully and opened the journal. The entries weren't long, just short notes, each dated, each one written in the months and years after his Parkinson's diagnosis. Some were about Megan, some were about my parents, dates, amounts, times they asked for money, how they reacted when he said no. One entry stopped me cold. April 3rd. Susan asked again, said it was for a dental emergency. Checked later, turns out it was for another one of Megan's credit cards. They never think I notice, but I do. I closed the journal and sat back on the floor. He'd seen everything, and he still chose to leave the house. The money, the trust to me, not to reward me, but because he knew I'd take care of it. The next day I met with Marcus and showed him what I'd found. He called in a financial advisor from his office, someone he trusted. Her name was Natalie, and from the moment we started talking, I felt like I could breathe again. She walked me through everything: how to secure the assets, how to protect them legally, how to make sure my parents couldn't touch any of it. We created a plan. Slow, careful, deliberate. Then I called Dr. Foster. I'd been seeing her weekly since the party. She was the one who helped me build the first real boundaries I'd ever had with my family. When I told her about the safe and what I'd found inside, she nodded slowly and said, "It's not just money, it's validation. You were never imagining it." I stayed quiet for a moment, then said, "I want to use it wisely." "Just like he asked." "Good," she said. "But make sure you're doing it on your terms, not theirs." I spent the rest of that week making the house livable again. The broken stained glass window had been boarded up since the break-in. Marcus connected me with a craftsman who specialized in restorations. He came out to take measurements, then promised to build a new panel that would match the original, exactly. I chose new paint colors for the downstairs rooms, soft blues and creams. Nothing too bold. I ordered slipcovers for the furniture, but kept the old rocking chair that creaked in the corner. Everything I changed, I did with care, not to erase Grandpa, but to carry him forward on Sunday. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat out on the back porch with a legal pad. The sun was warm on the railing. Birds moved in the trees. I started writing out ideas for the future. What to do with the trust, the investments, the house. How to make something steady and lasting that afternoon. Aunt Judy came by with a box of mason jars and a batch of homemade applesauce. She didn't ask for details. She just stayed for tea and helped me patch a tear in one of the curtains. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," she said softly, as she folded the fabric over her lap. "He always said you had a mind for this stuff." I looked at her and asked, "Do you think it's selfish? Not wanting to share it with them?" She shook her head once firm. "Selfish is taking what isn't yours. What you're doing, that's called stewardship." The next morning, Marcus forwarded me a message. My parents' lawyer had filed a petition. They were trying to claim the lake cottage Grandpa had bought back in the 80s was promised to them in a verbal agreement. There was no paperwork, just their word. Marcus said he'd handle it. But it was a reminder they weren't done. I stared at the email, reread it twice, then closed the laptop and walked back outside. The leaves were starting to turn, and I wasn't afraid. The week after they filed that petition, I didn't hear a word from them. Not my mother, not my father, not Megan. But I knew silence didn't mean surrender. Marcus kept me updated. Their lawyer had requested an extension citing new evidence, though there was nothing to support their claim. Grandpa had never mentioned the cottage going to anyone else. There was no document, no recording, no witness. Sometimes, Marcus said, when people lose control of a person, they go after the only thing left what that person loved. I stayed busy. The contractor for the stained glass window came by with the first panel, deep greens and golds just like the original. I watched him install it slowly, carefully. When the light hit it just right, it lit up the entire front room. Later that afternoon, I walked out to the mailbox and found a single envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter in Megan's voice. Claire, I know you think I don't deserve anything. Maybe I don't. But things are worse than you realize. You have no idea what kind of pressure I'm under. I've made mistakes, but I'm still your sister. If you won't do it for me, do it for Mom and Dad. They're drowning. Please, just send enough to cover what I owe. Then I'll be gone. No signature. I took the letter inside and placed it in the file cabinet with everything else. Then I called Dr. Foster. During our session that week, I read the letter out loud. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked, "Do you feel guilty?" I was quiet for a long time before answering. "I feel responsible," I said. "That's not the same thing," she replied. We talked through what boundaries look like in real time, how guilt wasn't a guide, how helping didn't always mean rescuing. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote out a different kind of letter. I asked Marcus to help me set up a fund, a locked account tied to a single treatment center that specialized in gambling addiction. The money wouldn't go to Megan. It wouldn't be accessible through our parents. It would sit there untouched until she walked through those doors herself, if she ever did. Marcus looked at me across his desk and said, "You're being generous." I shook my head. "It's not generosity, it's clarity." He didn't argue. The following Monday, Marcus received confirmation from the probate judge. The petition over the lake cottage was denied. No proof, no merit. It should have been a relief. Instead, the next blow came from a place I didn't expect. That evening, someone tried to access Grandpa's brokerage account. The bank flagged it and froze the activity. We traced the attempt. It came from my parents' IP address. I didn't call them. Marcus filed a formal complaint with the court, attaching the security logs and access attempt records. "This won't stop them," he said. "But it sends a message. They'll think twice next time." 2 days later, the alarm at the house went off again. This time, it wasn't just a break-in attempt. The cameras caught my father in the side yard trying to disconnect the security box. When the lights came on, he ran. I filed the police report myself. The officer who came by was kind, middle-aged, calm. She looked over the footage and said, "Family stuff like this is always messy, but don't let anyone convince you that this isn't serious." I thanked her. That night, I sat in the study and reread Grandpa's journal. I opened to a page from the year before he passed. October 17th. Claire came by. She helped me fix the lamp in the den. Susan called later. She needed $5,000 for a medical emergency. I didn't send it. I turned the page. October 24th. Megan didn't show up. Susan says she's finding herself. Page after page. He'd been watching them for years, not bitter, just observant. He'd seen the patterns. He'd chosen me, not because I was perfect, but because I didn't pretend. The next morning, I called the treatment center and set up the Megan Morgan Recovery Fund. It would sit there in trust, quiet, waiting. That afternoon, Aunt Judy stopped by with a grocery bag of pears from her yard. She sat at the counter peeling them slowly, lining up the slices in a bowl. "Your mom called me," she said, not looking up. "She wanted me to talk to you. Said she's worried about the family falling apart." I didn't answer. She asked if you were okay. Still, I said nothing. Then Aunt Judy turned to face me. I told her, "You're better than okay. You're building something solid." She patted my hand once. That's all he ever wanted. She meant Grandpa. I knew it without asking. That evening, I walked the perimeter of the house, checked the locks, tested the gate. It was quiet. No motion lights, no shadows, just the hum of crickets and the smell of fall in the air. Inside, I closed the door and stood in the entryway, hand on the railing. The next step wasn't defense. It was rebuilding. 3 months after the will reading, the house finally felt like mine, not just legally, but in the quiet details I'd restored. The stained glass window cleared out the basement, moved Grandpa's old workbench to the garage where it caught the afternoon sun. The porch swing didn't creak anymore. I'd oiled the chains and reinforced the frame. I sat there some evenings with a mug of tea, just listening to the wind shift through the trees. It didn't feel like I was waiting for the next blow anymore. Then one afternoon in late October, I got a text from Marcus Judge dismissed their latest petition. No further action required. I stood at the kitchen sink with the phone in my hand, reading the message, twice before setting it down. Outside, the leaves were copper and gold, spread across the grass like a quilt. The air smelled like wood smoke from somewhere nearby. It was over the last legal attempt, the final accusation dismissed without a hearing. That evening, Aunt Judy came by with apple cider in a thermos and a stack of fabric swatches for my upstairs office. We sat at the table in the kitchen, sorting through samples, soft greens, warm beige, muted blue. So she said, "You can finally breathe now." I nodded. She reached across and tapped the top swatch. "This one feels like you," she said after she left. I walked down the hall to the study and turned on the lamp beside Grandpa's old chair. The journal he'd kept was still tucked in the drawer. And I read a few entries again just to remember his voice. Then I reached for the folder I'd been building over the last month, the business plan outlined in neat sections, handwritten notes tucked into the margins I'd been working quietly with Natalie, the financial advisor Marcus had introduced me to. She helped me run the numbers, project startup costs, outline goals, plot timelines. I was launching a consulting firm focused on helping family-owned businesses manage succession planning and wealth transfer. It had started as an idea, but now it had shape, weight, direction. Next week, I was scheduled to meet with 2 potential partners. Both had experience with estate law and small business operations, and both had reached out after reading a short article I'd written for a professional journal. Marcus circulated. I was building something real, something steady on my terms. Doctor. Foster and I had talked through the final petition last week. She'd reminded me how grief doesn't always come in obvious shapes. You're not just grieving Grandpa. She'd said, you're grieving the parents you hoped for, the sister you imagined you'd have. She was right. Some days I felt clear-headed, driven. Other days I'd see a family in the park, a mother tying a scarf for her daughter, or hear a commercial about holiday dinners, and it would hit me like a wave. What could have been, what never was. My parents had made a few attempts to reach out after the petition was denied. First, a short email from my mother asking to talk just to clear the air. Then a voicemail from my father full of clipped sentences and forced warmth. I didn't respond. Then came the letter from their lawyer, a formal notice that they had accepted the $50,000 inheritance. It was the last thread tying them to Grandpa's estate. Marcus confirmed everything was finalized. No more filings, no pending motions. It was done. But Megan's path was still unfolding one evening in early November. I got a call from an unknown number. When I picked up, the voice on the other end was thin, shaking. Claire, it was her. I'm in the hospital. She said it got bad. I didn't know where else to call. She didn't ask for money, didn't blame anyone, just said she needed help the next morning. I contacted the treatment center, tied to the recovery fund, arranged for a bed, notified the trust administrator. They confirmed her admission later that week. I didn't visit, but I sent a note to the intake counselor just saying that someone cared nothing more. Our relationship wasn't mended, but something small had shifted. A door opened, even if it didn't swing wide. Aunt Judy and I had dinner the night before my first partner meeting. We sat in the dining room, the one I'd repainted in pale cream with candles flickering on the windowsill. She passed me the roasted carrots and said Harold would be proud. You know that, right? I didn't say anything at first, just nodded after she left. I stayed at the table for a while. The house was quiet, but not empty. It felt lived in, steady, safe on the desk. In the study sat a framed photo of me and Grandpa on the day I'd gotten into Berkeley. He had one hand on my shoulder, and that quiet smile he always wore when he was holding back proud tears. Beside it was a small wooden box. The one he'd carved himself inside was the key to the safe. I kept it, not because I needed it, but because of what it represented. He had trusted me, and I was ready to carry that forward. The final petition had been dismissed, the trust secure, the estate settled still. Even with everything locked in place, I kept waiting for one last surprise. It came in a quiet envelope dropped into the mailbox with no return address. I opened it on the porch. Sunlight catching on the edge of the sealed flap inside was a typed letter from my parents' lawyer, confirming that both my mother and father had accepted their $50,000 inheritances. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just legal formality. They'd taken the deal, not because they agreed with Grandpa's decision, but because they had no other choice. Marcus called later that day. "I just wanted you to hear it directly," he said. "They've signed everything. There's nothing left for them to challenge." I thanked him, then sat in the living room staring out the front window. For a long time, the trees had dropped most of their leaves by then. The lawn was soft with brown and gold. They were out of my life officially, and still, the silence they left behind was heavier than their noise had ever been. In the weeks that followed, they made several attempts to contact me directly. First, it was my mother leaving voicemails in her softest tone, telling me she missed me, telling me she'd always wanted peace. Then my father emailed short messages, clipped lines. "We're your parents. You can't just shut us out." I didn't respond. Dr. Foster had helped me draft a single message to send any time they reached out. "I'm not ready to talk until there's acknowledgement of what happened and a willingness to work through it in therapy." They never replied to that. Instead, the tone of their messages shifted again. Accusations, guilt, blame. "You've turned your back on us. This family used to mean something. How can you live with yourself?" I blocked the numbers, forwarded the emails to Marcus, added new names to the filter list. One day, a stranger called claiming to be a cousin from my mother's side, someone I'd never met. He said he just wanted to help the family heal. I hung up before he finished the sentence. Megan was still in treatment. I got monthly updates from the trust administrator. She'd completed, the first phase was now in counseling. She hadn't contacted me again, but she'd stayed. That was something I kept building. The consulting firm launched in January, small at first, just me and a part-time assistant working out of the converted upstairs bedroom. But the calls started coming in small businesses, family-run operations, people with stories that sounded too familiar. I listened. I helped them sort through estate plans and succession agreements, helped daughters speak up, helped fathers step aside with grace. Every case was different, but the root was always the same. Who gets to be heard sometimes after a long day? I'd walk through the house and stop in Grandpa's old study. It still smelled faintly of wood polish and paper. I'd sit in his chair, hand on the armrest. He'd worn smooth over the years one evening. Aunt Judy came by with a tin of cornbread muffins and a framed photo she'd found tucked away in an old box. It was from my high school graduation, me in my cap and gown. Grandpa beside me, smiling like the sun was on his face. I placed it on the mantel right beside the photo from Berkeley. "He'd be so proud of you," she said, settling onto the couch with her tea. "Not just for what you've done, but for how you've done it." I didn't answer, but I looked at the photo and felt the truth of it the next day. Marcus called again. "You might want to sit for this," he said, but there was a smile in his voice. My parents had tried one final move, filing a new petition to challenge a clause in the trust involving the lake cottage, but the judge had dismissed it immediately. Frivolous, the court called it. They were warned that further attempts could result in sanctions. That was the last straw. Marcus sent me a screenshot of the court document with one line circled in red petition, dismissed with prejudice, no further action permitted. I stood in the kitchen holding the phone, the afternoon light fading across the floor. My shoulders dropped, my jaw unclenched. It was really over this time. No more threats, no more filings, no more back doors, just the life I was building and the peace that had taken so long to earn that evening. I opened a bottle of cider and brought a mug out to the porch. The air was cool, the sky wide and clear in the distance. I could hear someone raking leaves. I pulled a throw blanket across my lap and let the quiet settle around me. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the ground was finally still under my feet. Spring came slowly. That year, the mornings were still cool, but by mid-afternoon, sunlight would spill across the porch steps. The daffodils out front, planted long before I was born, came back just like they always had, bright and stubborn. 6 months had passed since my graduation, since that day in the living room, when my diploma turned to ash and my family showed me exactly who they were. And in those 6 months, I'd built something new. The business was steady. Now clients came by appointment, sometimes whole families, sometimes one tired daughter trying to make sense of a mess her father left behind. We'd sit at the dining room table, the same one Grandpa used for holidays, and talk about trust, about legacy, about what mattered more than money. Megan was still in treatment. The counselor sent a brief update once a month. No relapses, small progress I hadn't visited. But I'd written a short note in early March. I hope you're doing the hard work. That's all. She hadn't written back. My parents hadn't tried again. Their silence had grown quiet instead of hostile, and that quiet was something I'd come to be grateful for. There were still hard days. Grief didn't follow a calendar. Sometimes I'd find something in a drawer, an old receipt with Grandpa's handwriting, a flannel shirt that still carried his aftershave, and it would hit me all over again. But most days the house felt warm, lived in whole. Aunt Judy visited often. She brought jars of jam stories from her garden, and once a new rocking chair for the back porch. We'd sit out there with mugs of tea, watching the wind move through the trees. "You know," she said one evening, "he'd be proud, not because you stood your ground, but because you did it with grace." I thought about that, about how long I'd chased their approval, how I'd stayed quiet, kept the peace, filled the gaps left by others, and how it wasn't until I stopped trying to be what they needed that I finally became who I was. This wasn't the family I was born into, but it was the one I'd chosen: Marcus, with his calm guidance, Dr. Foster with her steady questions, Judy, who showed up with comfort and never demanded anything in return. This was my circle now, this house, these memories, this new chapter. One morning, I opened Grandpa's journal to the last page. He hadn't written much there, just a line in soft ink, his handwriting a little more uneven than usual. It's not what you leave behind. It's who you trust to carry it forward. I closed the cover, slowly held it in my hands for a moment, then placed it back on the shelf. There's a kind of peace that comes when you stop waiting for someone to change, when you stop hoping they'll finally see you, and instead, you learn to see yourself clearly. For the first time, I'm not sure what the future holds with my parents or Megan. Maybe time will soften. Something maybe not. But I know this: what Grandpa gave me wasn't just a house or a trust or a second chance. He gave me the freedom to stop shrinking and the tools to build something lasting. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you for listening. And if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and standing for what's right, I hope you chose yourself. I'd love to know where you're listening from. And if this story stayed with you, feel free to share or subscribe for more sometimes. The family we build means more than the one we were born into. Take good care of yourself. We all deserve that much at least.